Awesome. So just if you undock that from the webinar console, you should be able to make it a little bigger, which makes it just easier to see. The main things, just, don't click anything. The most important thing is that when you leave the webinar, click leave webinar and not end webinar. That's the one superpower that you have in organizer status that would be detrimental.
Okay.
Especially someone who has not seen this before. But otherwise, just, observe. The questions will be popping into the questions box, and you can see how Val flags them and how she organizes that. So the Q&A is the last 15 to 20 minutes of the webinar.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I'm so sorry I forgot to invite you earlier.
No, that's okay.
I'm glad you messaged me. So basically, put yourself on mute, and you can do that by clicking on the little green microphone next to your name. And if you have any questions, you can email me or send me a chat in the chat box. But my computer's kind of frozen when I'm on the webinar, so email is probably the quickest way. And then when you leave the webinar, go up to File, Leave Webinar, not End Webinar, because that would end the webinar for everyone. So that, as I said, that's your one superpower as an organizer that we don't want to employ.
Awesome. Okay, thank you, Sam.
Sure,
and hi,
thanks.
Val.
All right, so David and Chad, as I said to Val, Wafame is another staff person here at CES, and she's going to be hosting a webinar in a couple weeks, so she's just hanging out in the background to see the exciting behind the scenes over here.
Sounds good.
So we're going to get started in about a minute. Looks like people are logging in. Everyone likes to log into our webinars at like 1:01 p.m. That's the popular time. So we'll get started right on time. Looks like everybody's got their webcams off, and again, we'll turn those on. You have to turn those on yourself, and we'll do that during the Q&A. So yeah, we'll get started. Thank you for doing this with us. We're excited for this webinar.
Great, us too.
Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. This webinar is being presented by the Clean Energy States Alliance, also known as CESA, and our topic for this webinar today is the Maryland Energy Storage Pilot Program, Exploring Business Models and Revenue Streams in PJM. Before we move on to the presentation portion of our webinar, I have a few logistics to go over. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of today's webinar. You can call in via telephone, or you can connect via computer, mic, and speakers. If you'd like to minimize the webinar console, you can click on the orange arrow that you see circled here. You can also click on that to expand the webinar console. And one of the things that you might like to do with your webinar console is to submit a question or a comment. You can type those into the questions box, and we will save about 15 minutes at the end of the webinar for the Q&A with the panelists. A final note for you, this webinar is being recorded. We'll send you an email with a webinar recording and a PDF of all the slides following our presentation today that'll go out probably this afternoon or tomorrow at the latest. And you can also find those materials on our website at cesa.org/webinars. So with that, I'll now turn it over to our moderator for today's webinar, Val Story. Val is a project director here at the Clean Energy States Alliance, and she is going to introduce our topic and get us started.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. This is Val Story, project director at CESA, and today we're going to be talking about Maryland's energy storage pilots. For those of you who don't know Clean Energy States Alliance, otherwise known as CESA, we are a nonprofit based in Montpelier, Vermont, and we work with state energy offices and agencies across the country to accelerate renewables. And in particular, we work with our state members on renewable energy policy and programs and innovation, and we place an emphasis on energy storage, equity, resilience, and of course, renewables. And on your screen, you see a snapshot of our membership. I believe we have 18 members plus GC. Next slide. So today's topic, as I mentioned, is on Maryland's energy storage pilot program. Maryland is a leading state on solar plus storage policies and programs, and the state is committed to moving forward to a more resilient and efficient electric grid future that encourages distributed energy resources, including solar and storage. And it has a well-established renewable portfolio standard, as well as energy efficiency programs that are supporting the deployment of renewables, as well as energy efficiency. The state offers financial incentives for storage development and has modified its permitting and interconnection requirements for energy storage. And through the recent Public Conference 44, Maryland is overseeing energy storage to create an optimized grid and has enacted an energy storage pilot program. We have two panelists joining us today. We've got Chad Dixon from Customized Energy Solutions and David Bloom from Baltimore Gas and Electric, and they're going to be providing background on Maryland's energy storage pilot program, from the enabling legislation in 2019 that established that program to the regulatory and the business models considered, the RFP process, the selection criteria, and the winning project bidders. They're also going to be discussing the various value streams and benefits in PJM of the proposed battery projects at the wholesale and utility level, and they're going to introduce us to, or CES will introduce us to its analytical tool for determining optimal battery dispatch. And then lastly, CES is going to be discussing future PJM market developments. As Sam mentioned, we encourage you to type in questions as they come up in the question dialog box, and at the end of the presentations, I'll be moderating the Q&A with the panelists. So with that, let me introduce our two panelists. We have Chad Dixon, Senior Consultant in Emerging Technologies Division of Customized Energy Solutions, and he specializes in the PJM footprint. Chad provides emerging technology investors, project developers, integrators, and other market participants with market intelligence and qualitative and quantitative consulting services. He also participates in the ISO RTO stakeholder process involving renewable energy and energy storage technology. And then we have David Bloom from Baltimore Gas and Electric, where he's the manager in energy acquisition and in their regulatory affairs division. He's responsible for overseeing BGE's default electric supply procurements and managing BGE's demand response wholesale market optimization and operations. He leads teams which engage in the PJM stakeholder process and among Maryland's PSC stakeholder groups. So with that, we can move on to the next slide and we'll kick it off with Chad.
Thank you so much, Val, and thank you everyone for joining us today. So we have a little over 150 participants here. I'm honored that you all would come and spend some time with us today to talk about the Maryland Energy Storage Pilot Program and explore some of the business models and revenue streams associated. So getting right into it, what we'll be going over today, as Val mentioned, we'll do a little intro on CES and BG&E. Then David will talk about the background, what led to the program, and how his group handled the legislation, the RFP creation and administration of such. I will talk then about the economics, a little bit about the economics of the proposed battery projects, the value streams, operational considerations, and then as PJM is very accustomed to changing certain dynamics, we'll go into what the future of those markets and value streams may be, followed by a Q&A session. And apologies for a little bit of the cutoff on the bottom here, the presentations. Please excuse that. It's a sort of a technical issue, but nevertheless, we will get to the content here, and none of that is compromised. A little intro for CES. CES is an energy service and consulting firm with over 20 years of experience assisting clients in wholesale and retail electricity and natural gas markets. CES hosts a best-in-class energy management and operations center where we operate over 11 gigawatts of assets as a third party and over 330 megawatts of energy storage, which is among the largest shops for energy storage operations in the world. We have worldwide operations in US, Canada, Mexico, India, Japan, and Vietnam, so sort of all over the place. And now I will turn it over to David. Oh, no, sorry. Let me just first discuss sort of some of PJM's business lines, or CES's business lines. So we have wholesale services, retail, future grid, and market intelligence. The market intelligence service is really where we got our start. CES Market IQ is where we have folks, either former ISO staff or folks that have participated in the ISO processes for many years, reporting out to all different types of agencies and companies on the market rules. Then with regards to storage, moving into the emerging technologies group, we have Storage IQ, which is sort of a regulatory tracking process and market developments for storage. We track all of that there and provide it in a sort of monthly service. And we'll talk a little bit later about our COMETS platform, which is competitive model evaluation tools for storage. This is our optimization engine that we run. Now I will turn it to David to talk a little bit about BG&E and then lead us in.
Yes, thanks, Chad, and good afternoon, everyone. And thanks for joining us. Very much appreciate the opportunity to discuss Maryland's storage pilot program here. It's certainly an exciting and innovative topic, and glad to see we have such a robust turnout. And I do look forward to everyone's engagement during the Q&A section later. So a little bit of background on BGE. BGE is one of the 6 regulated distribution utilities that's part of the Exelon family. BGE serves approximately 1.3 million customers in the central Maryland region. And I always like to note that our firm's origins date back over 200 years as the nation's first gas utility. And then just sort of lastly, just for some perspective here from the map, you can see that BGE serves approximately 50% of Maryland's electric load. Chad, there we go. All right. Excellent. So I'm going to jump in here and discuss some of the legislative and regulatory history that's led to the Maryland storage pilot programs. And I guess maybe even before I begin, I do want to thank the countless number of folks at BGE who have been participating in this really new endeavor for the utility. We're at sort of each turn among all the team members that we've been working with. It's always a new question with looking for innovative answers. And so I do appreciate everyone's back at BGE shop for their input and assistance with this. So where do we begin? Just about 2 years ago now, Maryland Governor Hogan signed into law the Energy Storage Pilot Program Act. And the act empowers the Maryland Public Service Commission to require each investor-owned utility to solicit offers to develop energy storage pilot projects with a cumulative capacity across all 4 of the Maryland IOUs capped at 10 megawatts. And so the Maryland Public Service Commission had previously established an energy storage working group as part of the ongoing PC 44 process, which Val mentioned earlier. And we think that the PC 44 was a natural fit since it's aimed at transforming Maryland's electric distribution system to ensure that electric distribution service is customer-centered, affordable, reliable, and environmentally sustainable. And guided by the act, the PC 44 working group and the Maryland Public Service Commission opened a separate docket, case number 9619, which I have linked in the material here, which is a great source for all information related to this topic. And so the docket that was opened up was our regulatory platform to consider the applications by the Maryland IOUs for their energy storage pilot projects. And so really want to highlight here that one of the more important aspects of the Act was that at least one of the projects offered could be owned by the investor-owned utilities, but they also should not also be owned by the utilities. So we had to consider various models, which you can see I have the 4 models laid out there. But even more so that's sort of one of the innovative features of the Act. But the second part here, and which we're going to be discussing, I think, more thoroughly today, is that the projects should all have dual purposes, and the primary purpose for these projects is focused on distribution grid reliability, and that's frankly where the vast majority of the value comes from for these projects to support the cost-benefit analysis. But the dual purpose aspect should also contemplated the value added from participating in the PJM wholesale market. So that dual purpose is critical and really guided the utilities throughout this process. And so from the Act and the PC44 working group, we discussed the 4 models that are sort of labeled here. We called them, the first model is a utility-only model, and this is where the utility would own the project, control the project for grid reliability, and operate the project in the PJM wholesale markets when the project is not providing distribution grid reliability services. The second model here is a joint utility and third-party model where the utility would own the project and control the project for grid reliability, while the third party would operate the project in the PJM wholesale market when not providing those distribution grid reliability services. And then the third model here is a strictly third-party owned model where the utility would actually contract with the third party to provide those distribution grid reliability services, and then the third party would then own and operate the project in the PJM wholesale markets. And then lastly here is, and this was again contemplated in the legislation and throughout the working group, is a virtual power plant or VPP model. And this is certainly an innovative model here that the utility can aggregate or use a third-party aggregator to receive distribution grid services from distributed energy storage projects owned by customers, and as well as meeting the dual purpose set out in the legislation, that the projects would then also participate in the PJM wholesale market when not providing those grid services. Chad, could you jump to the next slide? Okay, and so what you see here on the screen is my attempt at sort of combining all those models and showing you the results of the RFP here. And so what I lay out is the process that we used, that the utilities used to conduct the RFP and then ultimately file these projects with the Maryland Public Service Commission. So back in early 2020, the joint Exelon utilities, which includes Pepco Maryland, Delmarva Power Maryland, and BGE, opened up an RFP process to receive offers from vendors on proposals to meet the 4 models that I had just described. And as you can see here, we had robust participation for the 6 projects among the joint Exelon utilities. I think really great turnout from the vendor community, which is always great to see in something new like this. So the process then began sort of in the first quarter of 2020 to assess the offers that we received by the vendors. The focus, obviously, as the majority of the benefits were going to be coming from the primary function of distribution grid reliability services, a lot of that assessment came from our distribution, the BGE and the other utility distribution engineers in their planning area. Truth be told, I am not an engineer. My background is more in economics, and so I was involved in this from the PJM participation perspective. And sort of that's why I'm here today to talk about that topic. And so I will not field I will sort of defer any questions about distribution engineering to those subject matter experts. And so the experience through the RFP was very informative, I think, for all the parties involved, both for the utilities and the vendors. Obviously, we did have quite a bit of back and forth Q&A and opportunities to seek clarifying questions, both from the vendors and from the utilities. You know, this was going to be the first time for the utilities to engage in the PJM market this way, with this type of resource, with an energy storage resource. So we, of course, had a lot of questions ourselves to make sure we were seeking a project that was going to meet our needs, as well as you know, having it function and be able to optimize the value in the PJM wholesale market. And so where we ended up is we did have deadlines, of course, through the regulatory process. And leading up to the to an April 2020 deadline to submit our application, the joint utilities agreed for these 6 projects to engage with. So we awarded conditionally the projects for these 6 projects that you see listed in the table. And so I'm going to kind of attempt to sort of associate the winning bidders with the projects that you see there. And so for the BGE Chesapeake Beach project, which is a third-party model, that was awarded to Amoresco. The Fairhaven project, which is Model 1, a utility-owned project, we are working with the Hitachi Power Group. The Delmarva Power Elk Neck project is the virtual power plant project, the VPP project, and DPL is working with SunVerge on that one. The DPL Ocean City, Maryland project is working with Mesa Veterans Power, and you can see that's a utility-owned and operated option there, or actually model. The Pepco National Harbor project, which is a joint utility and third-party operated model, is working with AF Mensa. And then finally, the Montgomery County Electric Bus Depot project is working with Alpha Structure. And by way of sort of referring back to the legislation and regulation that you see on the far right-hand side, you may notice that the total capacity value adds up to 7 megawatts. The legislation contemplated a cap at 10 megawatts. The remaining megawatts are allocated to Potomac Edison, our utility in western part of Maryland. So they had up to 3 megawatts to also participate in this process with. And as you can see here too, the way that we structured this, the projects have obviously various capacity megawatt values along with their output ranges as well. So you know, that again was focused. Our primary value was focused on distribution grid reliability, so we used an end-of-life usable capacity perspective on there. So in other words, to truly value the distribution grid reliability for the period of time we were looking at, we wanted to ensure that by the end of that period, we were still going to be receiving this megawatt hour output. And so that's why we have it described as that in the project description section. And so sort of where we are now, back in November 9th, 2020, the Maryland Public Service Commission issued an order accepting the application, approving all 6 of these projects that were filed the previous April. We were very excited about that order, very much looking forward to receiving that order and getting a lot of the work really underway to then complete contracts with the vendors, begin permitting and the actual construction of these projects. And also, very importantly, we then began to consider how to enter the PJM new service interconnection queue request process. This process is necessary. It's in order to participate in the PJM wholesale market. These projects need to complete that process. And it is a very structured timeline per the PJM tariff. There's certain windows that are open, and so as of now, all the projects have entered that queue, and we're currently still working through the PJM interconnection queue process, and we do expect the PJM interconnection process to be completed sometime in mid 2021. And so once that is complete and the construction is then also completed, the projects will, as I mentioned before, obviously be able to meet that primary function of distribution grid reliability. But then sort of more exciting, at least for me and I think for today's discussion, we will also be ready to participate in the PJM wholesale markets. And so Chad, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, David. I always happy to talk about these projects. So getting into some of the economics of the project. So as David mentioned, and as you saw on the previous slide, there were different megawatt to megawatt hour pairings for the batteries. And in taking into account those different, what we call at CES configurations, it really impacts the ability for those resources to offer different and distinct wholesale market services. So for example, a shorter duration battery may be able to participate in frequency regulation, but maybe not in the longer market, which is a capacity market. So let's discuss a little bit about how those batteries are earning wholesale market revenues. First, I think if you've been in the storage industry and you've heard of storage in PJM, you probably have come across frequency regulation. Back in 2012, PJM really kicked off the storage industry's interest in their ISO with the implementation of Reg D, which is the fast responding dynamic signal that helps that PJM administers to resources that are able to respond instantaneously. And this service really regulates the frequency of the grid and is generally fairly lucrative for advanced energy storage resources, at least at the beginning. And now we've seen a little bit of a dip in prices with the impacts on COVID and the impacts on prices in general. But now it seems to be at least in the last few months rebounding a bit. So that's a good development, both for the industry as a whole and for these projects, frankly. In talking about frequency regulation, the storage assets are required to respond to grid needs on a second-by-second basis. It's an hourly market, so just giving a little bit of a background. But participation in this market really does require a lot from the battery in terms of cycles. So when in modeling, we really need to consider the participation in regulation against the potential long-term degradation of the system. So more cycles or more use of the battery on a daily basis can in fact have an impact on the capability of the battery in the long term. There is potential need to repower these batteries, and I'm doing air quotes here, and really this repowering means that you need to replace the specific cells in the battery because of participation degrading them over time. So when does that need to happen, and how much participation can you get out of that before you need to do such is always important to the entire battery project. It's a little bit different than modeling generation resource. So that's really where CES comes into play in our market knowledge. And then as we'll talk about it a little bit, the market frequency is generally limited. So there is a risk of not clearing in this market due to certain saturation. But as I mentioned, we'll go into that a little bit later and how to look at the future. Energy arbitrage is also a potential value stream for these batteries. This is charging the battery when prices are low, discharging when prices are high. The value of this service in PJM isn't isn't very high relative to some other regions of the country, generally because PJM's prices tend to be pretty stable, and the price volatility generally doesn't have a whole lot of value for batteries there. But talking about operating reserves, this is a little bit more storage centric here, because storage in PJM is considered synchronized to the grid due to its ability to respond instantaneously. And synchronized reserve is one of the more lucrative operating reserves products in PJM. The PJM has different prices for synchronized than they do for non-synchronized reserve. And as I mentioned, storage is always considered sync, so that's generally good. And due to the low amount of synchronized reserve events in PJM, it's generally not going to degrade the battery much, because, for example, sync, as you can see, you're only required to deliver energy, for a maximum of 30 minutes. So, that's a lot different than, for example, regulation, where you're using the battery much more. Then talking about the capacity market. So if you've been watching PJM at all, you know that the capacity market has been a bit of a hot button issue, and we are currently in the process of potential big change there. But with regards to how these batteries are modeled, we did consider the 10-hour rule, or the rule that states that batteries and quote unquote limited duration resources are valued in the capacity market based on the output that they can sustain for a period of 10 hours. So that's not great for a 1.5 hour resource, but ELCC may change that, and we are going to discuss that in a little bit. I'll also note that CES did conduct a specific webinar on ELCC back about a month ago or so. So if you're interested more, obviously, feel free to reach out, but you can also reference that webinar as well. And these are generally the wholesale market value streams that were considered in modeling these resources. Now, as David mentioned, this is really the number one value to the utilities from these projects is the distribution system benefits. So CES did take into account expected, what I call wholesale market outage times to account for the utility using the battery for some distribution system needs. Specifically, the utilities needed to have the battery available for certain times of need. This is either potentially during a peak time, but also looking at backup power. If they just have a unit trip offline or such, how can the battery help there? We considered certain hours that the utilities were going to use these batteries, and then we built that into the overall modeling of the system. Specifically, BGE and PEPCO had different requirements, but these needs were generally related, as I mentioned, to expected system peaks, and the specific practices and values varied by utility, and really the financial implications of that were sort of left up to the utility. So we really focus more on the wholesale market participation. How did we do such modeling? We at CES use a modeling platform called COMETS, which is a acronym for Comprehensive Market Evaluation Tool for Storage. It is a mixed integer linear programming approach, which determines optimal dispatch of the storage system to maximize market revenues. So this is how resources model making money in the wholesale market. And as you can see here, we do consider revenue streams such as regulation, arbitrage, sync reserves, and capacity. And generally, we model these revenues with a low base and high scenarios or sensitivities. And really what we take into account with those sensitivities, for example, the low would be, okay, what is the low case for the revenues of the resource. That considers more competition, potentially lower prices, potentially lower performance of the system overall. Base case is what we generally expect, of the resource, considering certain parameters that we put into the system. So that's the base case. It's pretty straightforward. And then the high case would be, less competition, more market opportunity, higher prices. So really giving our clients, and specifically BGE and PEPCO, the ability to see, what is the range of outcomes for these potential projects in the wholesale market, and what they should consider as feasible and reasonable. Some of the operational considerations and challenges for the batteries, they're definitely there, but they apply to batteries as a whole as well. Some of the distribution system benefits, obviously that's utility specific, but some of the major ones that I call attention to is the frequency regulation market, right? So the regulation market size is not astronomical in relation to the total PJM grid. The PJM grid is greater than 100 gigawatts, and frequency regulation market is generally less than a gigawatt of that capacity. You can see the ramp and non-ramp hours there and what PJM is required to procure. Reg D is limited to serving the 40% of the requirement, and those numbers for the non-ramp and ramp, that is considering that 40% cap on Reg D served from batteries. So around 255 megawatts of energy storage is currently qualified for Reg D. So you can see how we're sort of bumping up against that now. But generally these resources are sometimes they come offline for maintenance and things like that. So they're not always clearing at the cap per se. And then if quote unquote oversupplied in the future, I'd say this is more of a future scenario, PJM does clear Reg D megawatts based on performance scores. So you want to make sure that the batteries are performing really well, that you are not using them for too many other things, or you're, if you're doing frequency regulation, that's really what you need to be focused on because of the performance requirements and such that I mentioned, for at least for those specific hours. And then there's over a gigawatt of standalone energy storage assets in the PJM interconnection queue. So you need to be aware of the future risk of this market. And obviously we're modeling the rewards there, but there's definitely some risk to be aware of. Other considerations for the modeling, we did need to abstain from wholesale market participation during times of system need. As I said, this is sort of the wholesale market outage times that I mentioned. So that's something that we considered. And then lastly, if you are participating in the capacity market and you're looking to get that type of revenue, you need to consider what the requirements are for participation in that market. So if you are a capacity resource, that means that you're providing resource adequacy to PJM, and you are required to offer in to the day-ahead energy market. This is, the day-ahead energy must offer requirement. It is, it's being discussed right now what that's going to look like with the implementation of ELCC, but that is something to consider. And then the penalties for non-performance in the capacity market are heavy. So you need to understand what the specific requirements are, because you may want to reserve some energy to respond to any PJM emergency events like capacity events or minimum generation events, things where, or times where capacity resources are required to respond to PJM signals. And this last one, I'm sure, is sort of of great interest to folks. So where is the market going forward? What can BGE and PEPCO's batteries look forward to? So speaking about frequency regulation, it's a big topic in PJM. In PJM's regulation market settlement filing, which if you have questions about it, please feel free to reach out. But this is generally is how PJM settled with resources that were affected by the 2017 frequency regulation signal change. In this filing, PJM alluded to a future change in the regulation market that could involve collapsing Reg A and Reg D into a one non-energy neutral regulation signal. So this is a little bit into the weeds here, but Reg D and Reg A have different compensation mechanisms. And right now, Reg D is generally more lucrative, but PJM may look to change the regulation market structure in the future, as they have tried to do in the past. So there's no detailed plans on this change right now that are sort of going through the PJM stakeholder process, but I would look out for this in the future. However, I'll note that FERC has mandated through Order 745 that fast responding resources be compensated for that fast response capability. So there should be some room for these type of batteries going forward, regardless of what this signal change may be. And I think it's just important to note that there. Now, the capacity market ELCC implementation, as I mentioned, we did a whole webinar on this, and I could talk for hours and hours about what this could potentially mean for capacity storage resources. But boiling it down to the very high level concepts that are important to note. PJM is right now valuing storage resources, specifically capacity storage resources, based on their ability to sustain output for 10 hours. That is likely going to change. So PJM is implementing what's called effective load carrying capability methodology for the capacity market, specifically for limited duration and intermittent resources. These changes are looking like they're going to take effect for the 2023-24 base residual auction, which is PJM's capacity market auction, the initial auction for that delivery year. However, FERC needs to rule on PJM's filing that they have out, and PJM needs to actually get approval for this so that they can put it into place, right? But what the important thing for storage specifically to know, and generally I talk about 4-hour storage, is that's what most of the market consists of. It looks like 4-hour storage will receive around 80% capacity value against their nameplate rating. So that's in a nutshell what ELCC means for storage resources going forward, and resources will be able to derate. So as you saw in the previous slides, the configurations or the megawatts megawatt hour pairings that David was talking about in the winners of the RFP slide, those can derate to make it into the 4-hour storage class, and then the deration of 80% to whatever those resources are will happen linearly. Lastly, I wanted to mention a reserve market change that PJM has filed and has been approved. So FERC did recently approve the reserve market filing that alters the procurement mechanism and structure for non-regulation market reserves. So this is synchronized reserve and non-sync primary reserve structure. So previously it was more of a step function where PJM needed to procure a certain amount based on whatever step they were in. Now it's more of a curve, so it's becoming more efficient, and PJM is going to compensate resources that are offering those products more fairly, I'd say, and I think generally FERC would say it's more fair than the previous structure. The previous structure was that they would take the existing headroom from operating units and consider that as operating reserves, whereas those units hadn't actually offered the megawatts into the reserve market. Now it's more of the case that those megawatts that are considered for the PJM reserve requirement are all going to sort of be compensated more fairly. So happy to answer any questions on that as well. And I will just mention that CES, and specifically the Emerging Technologies Group, does offer a Storage IQ service that covers all of these ISO market developments on a monthly basis. So if you want to learn about the latest of ELCC and you really want to dive into the details, you have projects that will be impacted by this, I would definitely suggest looking, at least considering subscribing to Storage IQ, and definitely reaching out to me to find out more information. You know, these webinars are great places to get high-level details, but if you need to know more and you need to know how this will impact your specific resource, you know, we're definitely here for you and willing to take those take those questions. That pretty much wraps up our webinar for the day, and we look forward to receiving questions and chatting with you all about the projects and the PJM market.
Great, thank you.
Val to cover the Q&A. Thanks, Val.
Perfect, yeah, thank you, Chad. Thank you, David, for walking us through those business models and potential revenue streams. We're gonna move on to our Q&A. Chad and David, you're welcome to turn on your webcams for this portion if you'd like. I'll turn mine on too. Give me a second. All right, so we've gotten several questions that have come in. I encourage those of you who are still with us to feel free to use that question dialog box to type in any questions. So very basic question to start with. And David, this is maybe for you, but for both of you as well. So the storage resources in these pilot projects, behind the meter or in front, both, a mix?
Thanks, Val, and that's a good question. Yes, so for the projects in Maryland, they are all, I believe, all in what we consider front of the meter. They're not behind the meter projects. So they're as part of the wholesale market participation, they're front of the meter.
Great, thank you. And can you clarify the difference? I think this was like slide 2 or 3. The difference between the third-party model and the virtual power plant model?
So let's see. The third-party model you could think of as a third-party standalone would own and operate the resource, the storage resource. The virtual power plant VPP model is generally very different than that because it is more of a distributed resource type of a concept where the utility would enter into agreements with some number of customers to have storage, a much smaller version, obviously, a storage resource installed at their home for the utility then to aggregate and create a virtual power plant, if you will. So you can think of the VPP as this distributed power plant versus the third-party model, or even the utility-owned model, as a very more sort of centralized resource that's operated.
And just chiming in there for a second, so FERC has also issued Order 2222 that deals a lot with this issue and really clarifying the rules for these types of resources to participate in wholesale markets. We've done, I think, CISA and CES have done a webinar on that order, and we look forward to providing more. I will just also say that PJM recently was awarded a 6-month extension on 2222 filing. So I generally, my personal opinion, I think it's a good thing. We need to get it right. It's more important to get it right than to just get something in there. And I look forward to covering this. This is something that we cover in Storage IQ as well, but this is definitely directly related to sort of the VPP route, how these are going to occur. And I'll just say, for David's sake, the utilities are going to have a lot to do with this, right? This is all on their system. How they model this and how they model the impacts of these types of resources is incredibly important, and the impacts on their system, as these types of resources become more prevalent, is going to be substantial, material, I'd say.
Great, thank you. You covered one of the questions that came in. So moving right along. So Chad, this is, I think, a question for you. Does the COMETS model consider transmission benefits, or as you were developing the COMETS model and considering the business cases for these storage projects, did transmission benefits come up?
So the transmission benefits weren't as much of a concern for these specific projects, just because they were on the distribution grid, and really the benefits for the distribution system were really what were the focus. I'd say that more broadly, you know, we can consider transmission benefits as part of the overall, you know, I hate this term, but I haven't found something better, is the value stack of the resources, right? So we can consider that. It's generally those that may be a non-compensated value that resources would have on the grid, but really the COMETS models for investors are, you know, and developers, that they're interested in the compensation. So that's really where we're heavily focused, but we can certainly consider it.
Thank you. For the projects, are there any questions, concerns about dual use, dual participation in both the ISO and in the with the utility?
So there certainly are concerns, and those concerns will really need to be vetted through, and the expectation is a tremendous amount of communication. So as we described, the dual purpose is going to allow for a distinct period of time for using the batteries for distribution grid reliabilities, and generally, for the most part, it's to help alleviate you know, peak demand on a distribution substation level, you know, in a very granular level for distribution reliability needs, and those instances may only be a few times per year. And then when you consider all the other opportunities throughout the year, sort of in the slide that Chad was going over, I think it may have been about slide 11, the various PJM markets, you know, we're looking at in terms of hours of the year, participating in the PJM markets perhaps 90% of the time. The need for that distribution grid reliability purposes is a little bit more defined in terms of when we'll need it. And the vast majority of the time that we expect the batteries to be participating in the PJM markets. But it is a new approach for the utilities to be considered. So there are certainly a number of areas that we're going to have to work through to ensure that any concerns that we as a distribution operator have are understood.
Thank you. David, you talked about the 4 models that are part of the pilot program. What kind of battery technologies are going to be used in these projects?
I was afraid I was going to get a chemistry question along with some engineering question. I'm gonna interpret that question as a chemistry type of question. And I unfortunately don't have at the ready all the various sort of makeups of each of the batteries. I can provide that afterwards. I know it is in our filings that we've made in Maryland Public Service Commission case number 9619 that has more details in there. So I do apologize. I can't give a direct answer there on the actual makeup.
I can maybe chime in a bit. So,
okay.
So I think that generally these duration batteries, you know, the 1 hour, 1.5, 2 hour batteries, even up to 4, are most of the time flavors of lithium ion batteries. You know, we've seen in the market this divergence from, you know, considering, okay, lithium ion versus, for example, lead acid, and now you almost have lithium ion, and then it's gone from this to almost like this, right? Where we have, you know, sodium type batteries, and I'm not a chemist either, but you know, that's more, I would say, you know, with a certain degree of confidence, they're most likely lithium ion.
Thank you. Well, let's talk about revenue streams. Any details on how much PJM is paying for these services, frequency regulation, energy arbitrage, capacity markets, et cetera?
I'll let Chad answer that question.
I was gonna let David answer that one. So they're variable, right? And we have, like I mentioned about the low, base, and high cases, and we use certain proprietary mechanisms to derive those market prices that then feed into our overall dispatch model. But I just say, you know, as I mentioned, the frequency regulation prices were lower in the past year. I think it was generally due to COVID, and I wouldn't suggest that that's really indicative of the future market going forward, right? So I think that will be a rebound of prices there. In the capacity market, the values for resources will more have to do with the percentage that they get against their nameplate rating. So, you know, for example, a 2-hour battery getting 40% is much better than a 2-hour battery getting, you know, I guess would be like you know, less than 20% or so with the 10-hour duration requirement. So I'd say that the capacity market values for these types of batteries are going up. The regulation market is generally going to rebound to, I'd say, you know, probably where it was in 2019 and such. Energy arbitrage values, you know, it really depends more on the node. The values that you're getting there, is there volatility or congestion on the line that's being alleviated by the battery, and how can you make revenues there? But without sort of going into the actual, you know, very specific numbers, hopefully that helps.
Thank you. I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. I'm going to put a 3-in-1. Let's talk about evaluating these pilot projects. What's the plan? What's the plan? What's the timeline? The methodology? And then the last part of that is, do you foresee another round of pilot projects, another solicitation round?
So yeah, so thanks. I think the timeline is set, and the expectation in the legislation and is that projects will be operational in February of 2022. And I missed the second question. I apologize. The value stream, was that Val? Was that the reference?
What the evaluation timeline and methodology?
Okay, gotcha. Yes, so the evaluation of the projects, that all did occur in about the first quarter of 2020, and as I sort of noted, we did receive a number of offers for these projects, and so the criteria was laid out in one of my previous slides, but I think slide 9. But the focus, at least for my part and my input here, you know, the distribution grid reliability piece was the primary focus, and so our engineers looked over those projects to ensure that the projects were going to meet our needs from a reliability perspective. My team's involvement was more focused on, is the battery going to be built to give us enough flexibility to optimize in the PJM wholesale markets? That was another important aspect. We didn't want a battery that we were going to be limited to only operating once a year, for example. We wanted to be able to participate, like I said, 90% plus more of the time without degrading the battery, or, you know, sort of balancing and understanding, recognizing that there is going to be battery degradation. So we wanted to make sure the battery was built to that spec. And then to your last point, I do like to sort of somewhat jokingly say that this act is a pilot program, and I'm not a pilot myself, but I picture that pilots like to take off, and so I think the hope is that with our experience here, with the utilities experience here, that we do see more of these projects built in Maryland, and you know, having the opportunity for the utilities to own and operate them, I think is a great opportunity. Also recognizing that this is the way that the pilot is structured, that there is opportunity for third-party ownership, and so that's both of those models are part of this first pilot program, we do hope to see more growth here in the future. I think it's the pilot's ready to take off.
Yeah, and just to add to that as well, David. So it's definitely for BGE and the Exelon utilities. I do hope that it does take off in that way. I'll just say in PJM at least, it is an existing business model to be, this behind the wholesale meter resource. And I know that, it's a little bit, nomenclatures can be confusing, right? But this is a battery that's serving the distribution system while also participating in PJM markets, but it's not behind a retail meter, right? So behind the retail meter would be, for example, behind like a C&I facility that has load, right? The load that is being served here is the entire utility, I'd say. And generally, developers are looking at that as a potential way to, add a value stream to the wholesale market merchant revenues.
Thank you. All right, we are 2 minutes to the top of the hour, so I think we will wrap it up. I want to say thank you very much to both Chad and to David, especially to you, Chad, for bringing this topic up and approaching us for this webinar. It's great. For the audience, thank you for participating. You can listen to a recording, as Sam said. Probably by tomorrow you will receive an email with a link to the recording. If you have any questions, you should feel free to reach out to any of us. I believe our details are now up on your screen. And for those of you who love webinars, our upcoming webinar is, next slide. Got a little delay here.
That's a good one.
All right. Oh, yes. The next webinar is on Wednesday, April 21st at 2 p.m. Eastern on replacing peaker plants with clean energy in New York City. Hope you'll be able to join us then. Thanks again, everyone, for your participation.
Thanks, Val.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Cheers.
Thanks.